Good afternoon. This is Daniel here with Cops and Cons TV, and we're actually going to start this live show today with a super chat. So we want to go ahead and thank Steve Sanders for sending that in. So Steve is from DeLand, Florida. He says, I was arrested for not following mask policies on 12/12/22 at SSA office, me and another veteran. So it looks like he was arrested for not, SSA should be Social Security Administration, and it looks like Steve was arrested for not following the mask policy. So this is something that I'm interested in. Maybe Steve can give us a little more information on what happened. And Steve, I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry that happened. Typically when it comes to a lot of these mask policies, it's policy and not law. So I would be very interested to see exactly what you were charged with and why the police officers decided to do that. But that seems absolutely crazy. We've seen a lot of videos, especially from First Amendment auditors. Let's see. Steve says they arrested me for trespassing because I didn't leave. Okay, so they arrested you for trespassing because you wouldn't leave. So, one of the things that, I think a lot of education is out there, especially because of those First Amendment videos, First Amendment auditor videos, is that, if it's a public building, and which the Social Security Administration is, it's a public, government, federal, those all mean the same things, that as long as you aren't breaking any laws, you're not causing some kind of a disturbance, you're not yelling and screaming, you're not stealing from people, as long as you aren't committing any type of criminal offense, the government can't trespass you from a public building. So I'm sorry that happened. Hopefully you can get an attorney to get that dismissed and maybe a civil lawsuit. But Steve, thank you for the super chat. Thank you for sharing your story. That seems absolutely ridiculous and not a great way to end the year. So I'm sorry that happened. All right, so that's how we started the show, and regular intro right now. Again, this is Daniel from Cops and Cons TV. Just want to thank everyone for being in here. This is going to be our last episode of the year. So, we started doing this year, and I really appreciate everyone coming in and supporting the show. And one of the best things about this is just the interaction we have with the comments, going back and forth, talking about debating and discussing current topics and things that are happening in the news of police, law, and news. And it really is just the most interesting mix of all of those things kind of collide together, and that's what we try to talk about here. So if you haven't already, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like our channel, and share it. You can follow me over at Police Law News on YouTube, TikTok, Substack, everywhere else. But I want to appreciate everyone for being in. We're going to do things a little bit different today. There are some police stories, really important stories, that have come out in the last week or so. So we're going to go over those, and then at the end of the show, so make sure you stay tuned, we're going to go over what we think are the top 3 police law news type stories of the year. So we're going to get to that at the end. So if you want to put in the chat maybe what you think those might be, but we already have them picked. So we're going to go over that kind of at the end. Let's see. Steve Sanders says, he says, I have body cameras footage for you to watch and break down. Steve, we would love to watch it. We would absolutely love to watch that body camera and break it down. So if you want to go ahead and send that to us, I think we're going to put our email, if you don't already have it, in the chat. And if you wanted to send us that video, we'd be more than happy to go over it and break it down for you there. We would love to do that. And again, sorry that happened. Okay, so the first story that I want to get into and talk about, it's something that just happened pretty much in the last hour. That's when it hit the news. So it's a story that we really haven't covered much on here because there just is so much that we didn't know about it. So not knowing about something, it's difficult to really talk about it in an intelligent way. But it's the Idaho murder. So in Moscow, Idaho, at the college, there are 4 college-age individuals were murdered. They were stabbed to death, and it's been 7 weeks since that happened. A lot of the family members have gone on the news, and they've said that they've been frustrated with police officers. And if you listen to Nancy Grace and a lot of these other people who do like daily crime shows, this is just about all that they've talked about. But there was an arrest. So last night at 3 o'clock in the morning in Scranton, Pennsylvania, which is really far from Idaho, obviously, but in Scranton, Pennsylvania, they arrested a 28-year-old named Brian Christopher Kohlberg. He was arrested at 3 o'clock in the morning in Scranton, Pennsylvania for these murders. He's going to make his first court appearance sometime today. So right now, they haven't put out any other information out there. They haven't put any information out there. So it looks like that this guy could be the Scranton strangler as well. But they haven't put the information out there to see exactly why. But we know they took DNA and they were able to track this guy down. The only information that's been put in the news so far is that he is a college student, but he did not go to the same university that the students went to who were killed. So just wanted to report that because that just hit pretty much in the last hour that he was arrested. Okay, so the cases that I want to talk about, and this happened yesterday. So the first case I want to go over, some of the most important cases of the week. This happened yesterday. And Andrew Tate. So a lot of people know Andrew Tate. He's this far right wing kind of guy. He's like Jordan Peterson, only he's awful. And he's been living in Romania for a while. And, he was on the Patrick Bet David podcast not that long ago. He did about an hour and a half podcast. It was really interesting. But, one of the reasons that Andrew Tate says that he moved to Romania because the government was corrupt. And he said that he liked that. He said that the government was corrupt and essentially that his wealth, his money, he could buy himself influence in a corrupt government. So normally you don't hear people say that, but it was interesting to hear him say that. He said every government is corrupt, but in the United States, unless you're in the government, it's really hard to buy that influence. But he said that his wealth could help buy him influence. That's why he was in Romania. He said he was trying to play chess, not checkers. But he was arrested yesterday in Romania. He was arrested on suspicion of charges of rape and also of human trafficking. So him, his younger brother Tristan, and then two other individuals who they said are Romanian nationals, they were all arrested over at his compound in Romania yesterday. And one of the really interesting things about this is how he was caught. So Andrew Tate, if you remember, he was deplatformed from Instagram, Twitter, essentially every social media platform. He was deplatformed from, I believe it was sometime in the spring or the summer, where he was at YouTube. He was kicked off everywhere pretty much at the exact same time. So he was kicked off everywhere. The only social media platform to let him back on, was Twitter. Twitter allowed him back on when Elon Musk took over. So Andrew Tate is back on Twitter, and a lot of people were irritated about that. But last week, he got into a Twitter battle with Greta Thunberg, the 19-year-old climate activist. He got into a Twitter argument with her, and this is how he got caught. This is why this is so strange, is that when he was going back and forth with his Twitter argument with Greta, he posted a picture of himself, with some of his vehicles, or he said that he had 33 cars and he wanted her email address to send her a list of all the vehicles he have and the vehicles he has and the types of emissions that they give off. But in one of the pictures he posted during this thread, what he did is there was a pizza box that was from a Romanian pizza shop, which, I'm from Chicago, so I'm a real pizza snob. I can't imagine how good pizza in Romania is. But anyways, he had a pizza box from Romania. So it was basically from that picture that he took that had that pizza box in it. The Romanian officials knew that he was in the country, and that's how they knew that he was there to arrest him. So I just want to put in there, conviction in Romania on charges of human trafficking can carry penalties between 3 and 10 years. For rape, the penalties can range between 5 and 10 years. So I just want to say that, with anything, whether it's the United States or not, everybody is innocent until proven guilty. And I'm not saying this in an effort to try to defend Andrew Tate. I think that should be pretty obvious. But what I want to put out there is back in April of this year, April of 2022, people called the police on him in Romania, and essentially it was a swatting incident where they called and they said that he was holding girls captive and that essentially he was involved in human trafficking. There was a SWAT, whatever the Romanian version of the SWAT team is, the SWAT team went into his house. He was detained. He went down to police headquarters and he was released. It was later turned out to be someone called in a swatting incident. Basically they gave police false information. So I'm not saying that's what happened here, but since the swatting incident did just happen earlier this year, it's not something more going on. Okay, so let's see. Danzilla says it was his response video, not the car picture. Yeah, so I mean, okay, listen. I'm going to be real honest with you. I'm not someone who just studies Andrew Tate's Twitter feed. But what I do know is that something he put on Twitter, whether it was a picture or a video between him and Greta Thunberg, that is how he got caught from the Romanian officials. That's what they're being reported. If you know more about the Twitter feed than I do, fantastic. Let's say Steve Sanders says, okay. You mean guilty until proven innocent. Area Grande's ponytail says, you mean guilty until proven innocent. Let's see. James Bond says, the government absolutely can trespass you. Okay, so going back to the other case. The government absolutely can trespass you from public property. You do not have to commit a crime. That's inaccurate, sir. Okay, that I do not agree with. So, no, you cannot be trespassed from public property unless you commit a crime because it's public property. So if you could show me evidence or show me a law where that says different, great. Typically, trespassing when it comes to private property is whoever the business owner can go ahead and trespass anyone they want because they own that. If you own a gas station, if you own a McDonald's and you want someone's being a jerk and you or the manager or your agent want them trespass, you can go ahead and do that because you own the property. You are in charge of that property. But when it comes to public property, government property, it's public, it's government, we all own it. So I just also want to say that, you know, in the post office, there's something called Poster 7 that essentially gives the public and employees on what is allowed in public areas. So, you know, there's basically all of the rules of the post office are in there. And if you go into the post office and you look at Poster 7, if you follow those rules, the government cannot trespass you. Now, of course, they can physically go ahead and trespass you. There's nothing magic that comes out of the sky that prevents a police officer from handing you a trespass ticket. Obviously not. But if that were challenged in court, it would not be lawful. Let's see. Steve Sanders, when you watched the video, I left the interior of the structure while waiting for supervisors to arrive and then was arrested for remaining on scene. Steve, can't wait to see the video. Please go ahead and send it to us. Let's see. A post office is not a traditional public forum, though. It's a limited public forum, so it depends. In the foyers, and if you look on Poster 7, it pretty much defines what those areas are. So if it's in a public area, if it's in a foyer, that's considered public. Obviously, if there's doors that are closed or closets that are closed, you can't be opening doors that the general public doesn't have access to. But if you just go into a regular space, that would be different. Ariana Grande's ponytail says stamps are going up in January. Yeah, the stamps might be going up maybe because of Steve's lawsuit he's going to have against the post office. All right, so we talked about Andrew Tate. And like I said, the main point in a lot of these cases, what I think is interesting is not just the case itself, but some of the underlying things that happen in these cases, because a lot of them all kind of go together. And what I want to say, the main takeaway from this Andrew Tate case isn't that he was arrested. It's that the reason he got caught, the reason it was easy for police to arrest him was because of something that he posted on social media. So it's one of those things where it's like there are a lot of people who want people that they disagree with to be deplatformed and not allowed on social media. Well, when you do things like that, it actually makes it harder. So when people are maybe committing crimes, or even if it's just bad ideas, it's good to have the bad ideas out there so you can debate them. Just because Andrew Tate's bad ideas aren't on Twitter doesn't mean that him and millions of people don't have them. It's better for them to be out there in a space that can be debated. And then stuff like this, people make really silly and juvenile mistakes and get themselves in trouble with the police, or at least let the police know where their location is. All right, one more from Steve Sanders. Social Security has mask guidelines outlined in workplace safety plan, two of which the outlines that a mask should be snug around the nose and chin, but he has an 8-inch long beard. Yeah, so that would be difficult. That would be difficult to have it snug if you have a beard. So yeah, definitely, Steve, again, please send us that. Okay, the next case that I want to talk about. So this happened this past week in Richland, Mississippi. So I don't know if anyone's familiar with Mississippi. I'm certainly not, but this happened right outside of Jackson, Mississippi, which I guess is a pretty big city out there. A 21-year-old woman went into the Walmart. Her name is Corlinda McGinnister. So she went into the Walmart, and what she did is she took a Walmart employee hostage. There's a female Walmart employee. She went up to that employee, and she had a gun to her. She was essentially holding her uniform, and then at one point holding her hair. She was holding her, and she had a gun in the other hand, and she started just saying crazy things. She started saying that she's not here to hurt anybody, that she just wants to speak with a news anchor. Well, obviously, this resulted in a call to police officers. Police officers did the right thing. They got there, they got in almost immediately, and they started to confront Corlinda. They tried to get her to drop the gun. They tried to convince her to let the hostage go. But this is one of those things when you have an individual who's, aggressive, who obviously isn't in their right mind, and they have a firearm, holding it and threatening someone else, the police officers, they can only let that go for so long. Because just imagine if it was your family member who was there with the gun to them. How long are you going to let them go? Any any few seconds that goes forward, there's more of a chance that an innocent victim might die. So what happened was very predictable. Once the police officers were there and she wouldn't drop the gun, there was an officer-involved shooting. Corlinda McGinnister, she was killed by police, and the victim was saved. So that had a good result, and that there was no innocent death. This might be easy for me to say, and, so this sounds simplistic, right? And this might be easy for me to say, but if you don't want to get shot by police officers, don't go into a Walmart and hold someone hostage at gunpoint, and you're probably going to be okay. Let's see if we have any comments about this case. Steve says it was an insane video standoff. Yeah, so the video that I saw from this case wasn't necessarily from police body cam. I haven't seen that be released, but there were a couple individuals who, citizen journalists who decided to stay on scene, and they actually recorded it and then were able to upload it and got it to news outlets. So that is how I was able to see what happened there. But yeah, but there is pretty decent cell phone footage of the incident, and the police were in a position there just wasn't a whole lot that they were able to do. James Blonde 007 says exactly. Let's see any other questions or comments on that case. But yeah, definitely watch the video there. It's an absolute crazy video. It seems like the woman had some mental health issues, but again, there isn't a whole lot that the police officers could do in a situation like that. The next officer-involved shooting that I want, let's see, Steve says, I've seen the cell phone video, the hostage was frozen in fear. Yeah, if you look at the face of the hostage victim, I mean, she looks like someone who's in fear. She looks like someone who is being held hostage by a maniac with a gun. So again, officers did the exact right thing in that particular case. The last thing I want to say about this case is this is why I prefer Target. So next police officer involved shooting that I want to talk about, and I actually went over this last week, but there's been kind of a really silly and almost ridiculous development in this case. It was on 12/19, happened in Dearborn, Michigan. So 33-year-old mentally ill individual, though of course at the time the police officers didn't know that, and honestly it wouldn't have mattered. But 33-year-old named Ali Naji, he walked into a police station in Dearborn, Michigan. There was a uniformed police officer that was sitting behind bulletproof glass, kind of at a desk. Now, when I say bulletproof glass, there really is no glass that is totally bulletproof, at least not that they had in the substation. So, hopefully bulletproof glass will stop some of the rounds or some of the impact, but I wouldn't trust a glass in front of me to be 100% bulletproof if someone is shooting 15 rounds at me. Anyway, so Mr. Ali, he walked into the police station, and as soon as he walked in, he pulled out a gun, he pointed it at the officer who was behind the glass, and he started to pull the trigger. The officer reacted almost immediately. Now, again, good news, bad news. The good news is that the police officer's gun fired and the bad guy was killed. The bad news for the bad guy is that Mr. Ali is that his gun jammed. So for an unknown reason, his gun jammed, so he didn't fire off any rounds, but having a gun pointed at him and the individual pulling the trigger, the police officer reasonably responded. So this seems, I always talk about it that, there are some officer-involved shooting cases where, even if I think it's a justified shooting, I could say, okay, I could see where some people have a problem with this case. Other times I go, no, this is not a lawful officer-involved shooting. This looks like a criminal act from the police officer. And then you have people who are defending the officer, and I go, I don't agree, but I can kind of see where you're going. This is one of those cases that there is no other side to this case. Someone walks in, they pull out a gun, they point it at you, and they start pulling the trigger. The reasonable, appropriate, and proportional response from the officer is to fire in self-defense. That seems completely reasonable. But of course, this is why people don't like attorneys. The family of the individual who died, the attorney, has been going all over the media this week, basically criticizing the officer in the police department. Here's the criticism. It's twofold. The first criticism is that the officer didn't try to de-escalate. Hang on. So you're criticizing the officer for not trying to de-escalate with someone who's firing a gun at him. Exactly what type of de-escalation do you expect from a police officer? So, attorneys are, and again, I have law degree, so when I talk bad about attorneys, I'm doing it kind of tongue in cheek. But this is why people dislike attorneys. It's because they say things like this, things that are just, yes, of course, you have to represent the family. That is your absolute job. Everyone deserves representation in every legal matter, aggressive representation. But when you say things in the media that are just objectively ridiculous, this is why people don't like attorneys. So no, obviously there was no way for the police officer to de-escalate. The idea that the officer is being criticized by anyone is absolutely nuts. And the other criticism, said it was twofold, is that the officer shouldn't have shot because the individual had a history of mental illness. Now, I'm not sure about what it's like in Michigan, but at least where I'm from, when there's a gun and someone's pulling a trigger, yeah, it doesn't matter if the person pulling the trigger has schizophrenia or not. That gun is going to work the same. So, again, not just de-escalate, but it seems like the attorney wanted the police officer to factor in whether or not they should try to save their own life because of the mental status of the person pointing a gun and pulling the trigger at them, which is absolutely insane. So, yeah, Archie says nobody wants to talk about the logistics. Bruce Blankenship says just pointing or brandishing. Yes, so it's, let's see, no other questions. So I mean, even what we talked about this in a couple of other cases that, there really isn't much of a difference. And again, in this case, the individual had the gun pointed at the officer and was pulling the trigger. But kind of like you said, like, is there really a difference between a gun being brandished and pointed? So what I would say is not really. If you have someone who you think might be a threat, if there's a gun pointed at you, or if an individual has a gun that's pointed to their side, the difference between the hand and being shot and, going from a gun being at someone's side to pointed at you is tenths of a second. So I can't react that fast. If you think that someone can react that fast, then yeah, make an argument that there's a difference. Most people are not Jason Bourne and they cannot react that fast. Let's see. Dan Zilla, attorneys are just trying to become famous nowadays. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's absolutely part of it. There is an entire culture of attorneys out there who, no matter what the circumstances are, they feel that if they can lie and say ridiculous things about police officers, that they are going to get some traction. Unfortunately, that's true. Ben Crump has made a career out of doing this. Willie Weed says, sounds like another suicide by cop. Absolutely, this is 100% suicide by cop. Let's see, Stray Dog the Exposer. A baseball player only has 0.03 seconds to decide if the pitch he's going is to be a strike or a ball. Yeah, I would say that's probably correct. And if he's wrong, which, baseball players are wrong, even the best baseball players are wrong 70% of the time, you don't die. So I think we need to take that into consideration. Archie says, I went to school to be a lawyer, but I only received a C, so I became a public pretender. Okay, let's see. What can I do? The shootings are real. Yeah, I mean, it's dangerous when someone has a gun pointed at you. There's just not a whole lot you can do. Yeah, Bruce says, but his life is not on the line. Yeah, that's 100% correct. Yes, it's difficult to react to a baseball, and again, even the best baseball players are wrong 70% of the time, and when they are wrong, there's no risk of them dying, unless, of course, it's Randy Johnson against John Kruk in the All-Star game. Let's see. Steve Sanders says, how often are police... Oh, it's a good question. How often are police involved in a shooting in their career? Oh, Steve, that is such a great question. So I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but I know the numbers in general. So let's talk about it this way. So there are approximately 1,000 deadly officer-involved shootings every year. So 1,000. Now, how many total shootings there are, I'm not sure. Is it 3,000? Is it 5,000? I don't know those numbers. But when police officers fire a gun and someone dies, it's about 1,000 times a year. There are approximately 800,000 police officers in the United States. So, essentially, 1,000 out of 800,000 is going to be involved in a deadly officer-involved shooting every year. So the vast majority of police officers go through their, let's see, Vast majority of police officers go their entire career without being involved in an officer-involved shooting, and that's actually the goal of most police officers. No one wants to be involved in an officer-involved shooting. Okay, well, we're going to put up here some FBI statistics for law enforcement officers assaulted and killed in the line of duty. So nationally, there's about 60,000 law enforcement officers who were assaulted performing their duties. This was back in 2020, and this actually segues pretty nicely to what I was going to talk about next, and kind of a recap of the year of what it's like to be a police officer. So we have some numbers up here from 2021, but if we look at this year, here are some of the numbers this year. So in 2022 so far, 228 police officers have been killed in the line of duty, and 64 of those police officers were died by gunfire. Now, I looked up some of this stuff on the Officer Down memorial page. I looked it up, and what I thought was interesting is they have the time on duty of these police officers. So of the 228 police officers who died on duty this year, the lowest one had 30 days on as a police officer, and the highest one had 45 years on as a police officer. So it's one of those things that you could be early in your career, it could be your first day off of training, or again, you could be on the department 5 years older than 5 years longer than I am old, and it could happen then. You just never know. And the reason why I wanted to talk about kind of like the total police officers is because last week we got a question saying a comment saying that, being a police officer, it's not the statistically most dangerous. And I agree. It's not. A police officer is not the statistically most dangerous job. Really, if you look at statistics about, like health implications long term, being a firefighter, because of all the smoke inhalation and stuff and the dangerous chemicals, being a firefighter might actually be more dangerous than being a police officer. But there's something about, and the reason why that people, I don't want to say care more about when police officers die, but why it's such news. The reason it's news is because there's just something emotional that just really gets to us kind of on a human level. When you have someone who makes it their goal for not much money to go out there and try to protect the community. And while they're trying to protect the community, you have people who are trying to damage the community, so the bad guy hurts or kills the good guy. That's an interesting news story. So that's why when a police officer dies, it's almost always covered. And what I'm saying isn't controversial, because look at how many television shows and movies there are about police about this exact issue. So people are interested in it. I'm interested in it. Everyone watching this live show right now is interested in the things that police go through in the interactions between citizens and police. Let's see, Stray the dog, exposure, it's more dangerous to be a clerk at a convenience store. Yeah, you know what? It's statistically that might be the case. Let's see, Steve Sanders, more police die than soldiers every year. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So is a construction worker. Yeah, I mean, we can all make a list of the statistically more dangerous jobs than being a police officer. But again, there's something about it, because when you're a clerk at a convenience store, your goal every day is to help people check out. When you're a police officer, your goal should be to protect the community, to keep everybody safe. So when you're voluntarily putting your life out there to keep everybody else safe, there's something that hits people on an emotional level when those people are killed in the line of duty doing the job of trying to protect other people. Yeah, and Free says firefighters are equipped to cope with smoke, etc. They absolutely are. Let's see, Deshaun crew, Ben Crump will be there for every shooting. Police will use that gun. Forget about it. I don't know what that means, but yeah, Ben Crump is there for almost every officer-involved shooting. He tries to get himself involved. This is how he's made himself a millionaire, by descending on communities who just had a tragedy, saying dishonest things in the media, and then getting everyone to fight and riot, and then extorting the city or the state to settle a lawsuit in order to stop the riots. So that's kind of his business plan. So it's been a good business plan for him, but objectively we should be able to say whether or not we think we like what Ben Crump is doing. So okay, so I just talked about in general, how many police officers die every year. Said there's been 64 that have been killed by gunfire, and we actually have one die last night, and that's what I want to focus on here for the last actual news story of this year. So it happened last night, 12/22, in Riverside County, California. The deputy, he had 8.5 years on. He was with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. His name was Isaiah Cordero. We have limited information because this just happened yesterday, but here's what we know. know. What we know is that Deputy Cordero, he conducted a traffic stop on a vehicle. As he was approaching the car, the driver of the vehicle shot him and killed him. The driver of the vehicle then fled the scene. There was obviously police were right on it. They were able to locate the vehicle. There was a high-speed pursuit. It went across a couple different states. Eventually, that vehicle crashed. It was disabled, and the individual, the offender, he was killed by police officers. I don't know if they've released the name of the individual, of the offender. That's not that important. I don't like to say names of offenders who do stuff like this anyways, but what the information that they have put out is that, and this kind of goes back to a lot of the other bigger picture issues, that, a lot of these shootings and these police cases that we highlight and talk about on this show, it's not just about this individual case, that all of these cases have really interesting elements to them that kind of spread across and go to different incidents and different things across the country. So the thing about this guy is, this offender is, in 2021, he was involved in a situation where he actually killed a police canine. He went to trial. He was convicted. The charges that he was convicted on, it was other than just killing the police canine, all kinds of felonies, but it was from that same case. What happened is that he was awaiting sentencing, and his sentencing was going to be somewhere between 25 years to life. Well, he was granted bail, so he was essentially let out. He was let out to be free while this was going on. While he was free, he missed a court hearing, he was arrested on a warrant, and then he was released. It was upon release that this happened. So again, here you have a person who has already been convicted, and they're waiting on at least a 25-year sentence. Like, the idea that this individual isn't going to be violent against, this time it happened to be against police, but most of the time it's not against police, it's against regular random citizens or other members of the public. So, the idea that, when people are convicted of violent crimes and we know that they're going to be going to prison for at least 25 years, the idea that we're those few months in between that we're just going to let them out on bail is absolutely insane. There was a tragedy last night, and a young police officer lost his life, and that was an absolute horrible way to end the year. So I just want to send out my thoughts to the to the sheriff's office out there. That was absolutely terrible. Let's see. Okay, any other comments about any of these cases? Some of they're talking about cop watchers. Let's see. We talked about Ben Crump. All right. Okay. I think we got to most of those comments on there. Let's see. Okay, so here's Steve Sanders says, who has jurisdiction over federal property? So the jurisdiction over federal property, so it would have to be a federal law enforcement. So, does the post office have security? Are there federal agents? Are there federal protection police officers? So it would be someone federal. What normally happens is, because even though it's a federal building, it's usually located within some kind of a city. So normally when people at the post office call police officers, it's city cops who are now, because the building is in the city, now police officers trying to enforce city laws in a federal building. So that gets a little bit complicated. Of course, police officers can go and try to mediate and try to and give out business cards and try to calm situations. And of course, if there's an emergency, a local police officer, like if there's an active shooter inside of a post office, I don't think most people are going to say, well, you don't have jurisdiction there, so you guys have to just stand around and not actually go in. No, that's absolutely ridiculous. So police officers can respond, but the issue is what type of enforcement action can they take? Let's see. And what normally happens is that most federal spaces actually have contracted security guards that are armed. So that's normally who handles it. But, most of the time, local police can get there quicker. It's just once they're there, if there's no immediate emergency, like an active shooter or something, if there's no immediate emergency, what type of enforcement action can police officers take? That's always what the question is. And if anything, what I've seen in a lot of these First Amendment videos, and Steve, I'm not sure if that's what happened with you, but in a lot of these things, it's not that the police officers are bad people, it's that they just don't know. Maybe they haven't had the training, they haven't been informed, they haven't seen the First Amendment auditor videos, but it really is up to not only the individual police officer, but the law enforcement agency to say, hey, we have 18 post office in our jurisdiction. If you guys and girls go there, here's what you can do, here's what you can't do. Just remember. So that kind of information is so important on an administrative and training level to get out there. And I just think that's really, really important. Nathan Hart says, do federal agents have jurisdiction to enforce state laws as well? Typically not. Typically, the feds can just do federal laws, and then if the feds need, if the federal agents need state officers to come in and do something, well, they can just ask them to do charges based on whatever evidence that they do. Let's see. I don't think Free says I don't think they need a car. Each they can go out in pairs. That's only a few million for mental health. Okay, I'm not sure what that's in reference to. Let's see. Dan Zilla says, I saw comments on the video saying, why do they need so many police during the chase, and saying tax dollars wasted. Yeah, this is in reference to the officer, the officer who was killed in California. Yeah, I mean, when you have, not only when you have a police officer killed, when you have anyone who just committed a murder and they're fleeing and running from police, the idea that like every cop in every jurisdiction isn't just going to be on it trying to end this as quickly as possible, that's an unreasonable expectation. Because everybody wants to help. Everyone wants to get the bad guy in custody. Every police officer wants to stop the death and the carnage. Again, there's a lot of times we should be worried about tax dollars. This isn't one of them. All right, let's see. Homie says, police are the muscle of the law, not lawyers, so we should give them some margin of error instead of acting like legal smartasses on YouTube. That's actually an interesting comment. So if we look at what the law says on that, is that, and I in principle, I 100% agree with you. And you know what it basically says is that when it comes to court, police officers are allowed to make a mistake of fact. So if a police officers, think that they saw something, and then it's reasonable belief, and they go down this path, and it ends up being that they saw something that wasn't true. So if police officers make a mistake of fact, essentially that typically doesn't get cases dismissed. But what does get cases dismissed is a mistake of law. So police officers, they're not permitted, at least when it comes to whether or not a case is dismissed, police officers typically are not allowed to make a mistake of law. Now, here's an example. Like, let's say you have a cop out there who's running traffic, and a vehicle is driving 10 miles below the speed limit, and an officer stops him because the officer thinks that there's a minimum speed ordinance. Officer stops him, arrests the guy or girl for driving while intoxicated. It goes to court. Well, let's say that the officer was wrong. There actually is no minimum speed ordinance in that city. Because the officer made a mistake of law, that case is going to get dismissed immediately. Now, again, if the officer made a mistake of fact, not necessarily that case is going to get dismissed. So there's a difference between mistake of law and mistake of fact. But Homie Kane, that's actually a really good comment. Let's see. Free says cops could go out in pairs. This would save dollars that could go into mental health facilities. Okay, so I'm not sure what you mean by that, but let's go down that rabbit hole a little bit. So most police officers do work in pairs. So not all the time do they ride in the same police vehicle. Sometimes they're in separate vehicles, but they typically take calls together. Here's an example of that. So I'm originally from Chicago, and I've done ride-alongs with Chicago police. Most Chicago police officers ride 2 officers to a car, and they don't take those cars home. It's not their car. Essentially, these cars are ran 24 hours a day. You come in for your shift, you and your buddy get in a car, you put all your shit in the car, you drive it for 8 to 10 hours, and then you get off shit, you put the car in, and the next group of officers who are coming in, they take your car. That's how it works. So what happens in a situation like that is that the car is essentially running 24 hours a day. Well, what they found doing different studies about this is that cars actually last less longer when they're driven, because cops drive cars hard. I think we all know that. When cars are driven, pretty much constantly hard for 24 hours, the amount of mileage and maintenance actually costs the city more. Now, here's what a lot of other police departments do. They say, that's your police car. Officer Smith, that is your police car. You're going to take that police car home. It's yours. You can drive it off duty as long as you're not drinking. You need to go to the grocery store, you need to go to the gym. You can drive it off duty, and you only drive it, during those things, then mostly for work, when the car is typically out in front of the police officer's house. So what many municipalities have found is that, yes, maybe that seems like a waste of tax dollars, but it's actually not, because it's found that when police officers have one car that they're going to be driving for the next maybe 3 to 5 years, they take care of that car, and the car isn't being driven crazy hard, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So there's arguments on both sides. Also want to talk about something. There was a study done in the 80s called the Kansas City Patrol Study. And exactly what you're talking about 1 or 2 officers in a car, they actually studied this in Kansas City in the 1980s. And it was a while ago, but it's still a relevant study. And what they wanted to see is, okay, if police officers are in one car or if they're in two cars, what does that do? One, does it make it less safe for police officers? And two, does it reduce crime? And what this patrol study found is that when you put police officers in one car, it doesn't make them any less safe. And the reason for that is because let's say that there's a domestic violence call or a disturbance at a bar. Just because a police officer is in the car by themselves, they're not taking that call on their own. Now, maybe they get to the call 30 seconds before their partner and they wait halfway down the block and then they drive together. So just because two officers are in two different cars actually doesn't make them statistically less safe. If an officer's on a traffic stop, they can call out for backup before they actually make contact with the driver. So it doesn't make them less safe, but it gives the impression that there's more police officers out there. Let's think about this in an area. Let's say you have 20 police officers in an area. So, it's hard to say how big that geographic area is, but, let's say it's a section of the city of Chicago. One section of the city of Chicago. There's going to be more than 20, but, let's just use that as an example. So here you have this one geographic area. If you have two officers to a car all day long, you have 10 police cars driving around. Well, with the same amount of actual cops, now you have 20 cars driving around. And again, it's shown that it actually isn't any more expensive for cities. So that's a really good question. Aria Grande says, ponytails, they should only be allowed to drive the car for work, not for personal reasons. Yeah, I think that's reasonable. And you know what? A lot of departments have that policy, but Ariana Grande's ponytail, here's what some cities found. So what they found is that, essentially what they found is that if, let's say, a police officer wants to go to the gym, as long as they have all their police stuff in the car somewhere and they're taking that car to the gym. So, well, now that vehicle is being driven around the city, and that affects traffic. That makes people think that maybe there's a bigger police presence than it is. So it actually makes citizens feel like that there's a bigger police presence and makes citizens feel safer. Also, let's say that officer is in the gym for an hour or two at Bally's Total Fitness or whatever gym you happen to have. Now, here you have a police car in the parking lot of a gym. Well, the business likes that, obviously, right? All the other, I know that a friend of mine actually just had his vehicle broken into and some stuff stolen out of it last week at a gym in a nice area at 4:30 in the morning. So, the idea of a police car being parked in a gym parking lot, like, that isn't a bad thing. What if it's a popular gym and you have 8 police cars there? So like I said, so it's a lot of departments feel the same way you do, and they have those policies, but there are reasons why a certain municipality might see an advantage of doing that. But the idea of, I think it's a good idea for police officers to have take-home cars, to, drive them, whether or not they drive it off-duty or not, I don't think that's as big of an issue, but not hot riding cars 24 hours a day. I think that's pretty antiquated and not a great thing for cars. It actually costs cities more. Let's see. Stray Dog says it'd also help if they were actually taught the law instead of spending the majority of their time in academy learning self-defense. That's an interesting comment. Stray Dog, the Exposer, what I can say is you can actually go on to any state website, the Law Enforcement Academy, and you can see what the curriculum is. You can see, okay, in order to be a police officer, you have to be in the police academy for, let's say, 26 weeks. During those 26 weeks, there's this much instruction on crisis intervention. There's this much on constitutional law. And if you look at defensive tactics, it's actually one of the lowest things. When it comes to firearms range and defensive tactics, that's one of the lower things. The vast majority, like 80% of the police academy is classroom. Is sitting there learning classroom. That is 80% of the police academy in most places. There's an argument made that if police officers had more instruction when it comes to defensive tactics, maybe when they got into situations and they knew how to, ground fight or grapple, maybe they would be able to end situations quickly, more safely, so that there wasn't an officer involved shooting later on. So the argument can be both ways. Let's see, one more comment. Pin King says, going back to active shooters, it makes it easier for officers to respond to the active shooter situation. Yeah, 100%. Pin King, you're right. So the more officers you have in a car, that can get there quicker. If there's an active shooter, you're absolutely right. But what I would say is that if there's an active shooter, you're going to get every cop in the area, unless it's Uvalde, of course. You're going to get every cop in the area there pretty quickly, and so it probably doesn't make that much of a difference. But yeah, technically you could probably get 2 officers there more quickly if they happen to be in the same car. Let's see. Cops should know our Constitution, Willie says, in short, but they just don't. Yeah, I mean, Willie, that's a fair comment. And again, police officers have to learn so much, and they're not lawyers. So I went to law school part-time over 4 years. My student loan bill is over $100,000. So yes, I there's no way to take that and even after law school, there's a lot of attorneys who don't know constitutional law all that well, or who barely passed that class or that section or that section. So the idea that police officers are going to be constitutional scholars like Alan Dershowitz isn't reasonable, but yes, you want police officers to be educated on the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendments of things that they're dealing with all the time. More training, more education. I'm always an advocate for that, but the idea that police officers, based on the police academy, are going to be constitutional scholars, that just isn't a reasonable thing to respect or to expect. Let's see. Free says, all good points. Hadn't considered maybe they should have a car reach. Yeah, no, like I said, I think there's interesting. And Free, I appreciate you asking questions and for saying that because, yeah, sometimes you just might know. All right, so I want to talk about the most important and interesting cases of the year. And when we were making this list, when it comes to some of the criteria that I looked at about whether something is, like the most important cases of the year, not just how much we talked about it or how much interest there was, but is there fallout? So after this case happened, what else happened? Was there a paradigm shift? So that's what we're going to get into, and I'm going to talk about what I think are the 3 most important cases of the year, and put in the comments if you disagree. If you think that I missed one, which I absolutely do, put in the comments. Maybe we can cover it next week as an overlap of cases that I just didn't get to for whatever reason. Most important case is Uvalde. So we're going to start with number 1. There's no question that Uvalde was the most important police case of the year. This is for a lot of different reasons. Not just because it was a horrible officer-involved shooting where a mass shooting where a lot of kids died, and also the police response was also awful. So it wasn't just because of that, but it's because of some of the fallout, some of the things that we learned from this shooting that we all already know. Also, and not just because of the issues when it comes to public transparency. One of the reasons why Uvalde got the attention it did is because you had multiple different police departments who not only did things mostly wrong, some right, but mostly wrong, but you had public information officers who, and then the governor's office in Texas who was kind of trying to manage things. Like, for example, the Uvalde City Police Department had officers on scene, and they felt that they were being unfairly maligned in the media. So the city of Uvalde, the mayor of Uvalde, he put out the body cam footage so it was available for everyone. We can criticize Uvalde City Police a lot, and we absolutely should, but they wanted the body camera footage out there because they thought that it would vindicate their officers. Now, that's incorrect, that's insane, but that's what they thought. The governor of Texas and the Texas Department of Public Safety, they said they didn't want any video out there, and they actually tried to prevent in court the city from releasing body cam footage. So the interactions between the different local levels of law enforcement is interesting, and it's something that we should be paying attention to. I always, not just because we have a body cam channel here, and we like the body cam footage, but the public deserves to know. There should be transparency in policing and in government, and we should always err on the side of putting the information out there. Yes, of course, if there's an investigation ongoing, if there's a child, no, we don't want to put out stuff that's going to complicate that. But 2 weeks after Uvalde happened, yeah, we need to get that body camera footage out there. Don't have a lot of good things to say about Uvalde City Police, but at least they released the body cam footage. I think that was the absolute right move. And again, they were being told not to do it. So we learned a couple of other things about Uvalde. So we learned that small police departments are not equipped to handle complicated emergencies. And the reason I say this is because a lot of times there's criticism when I'm on TikTok or I'm on YouTube or I'm on the show. A lot of times there's criticism where people complain about police budgets. Everyone becomes a fiscal conservative somehow, where they say police are spending too much money on this military grade weapon and gear. Well, okay, fine. You want to say that, fine. But, what are the reasons why the police officers who got to Uvalde, what are the reasons why they didn't make entry in? Well, maybe we have opinions, but they were waiting for more rifles and for ballistic shields. So, that's typically in the category of military grade weaponry, and a lot of times you can imagine someone on this show, if a year and a half ago I was saying, hey, the Uvalde School Police Department, the school resource officer officers, they're asking for more AR-15s and they're asking for ballistic shields. Let's put out a poll. What do we think? My guess is the vast majority of the poll is going to say they don't need this. There's school cops. There's school cops, and there's also city cops that are there. Like, there's also, like, what is the school? That's a waste of money. But obviously, we all wish they would have had these things. Maybe it would have made a difference. Again, maybe it wouldn't have made a difference. But so I think we see that the small police departments are simply not equipped to handle emergencies. Not just when it comes to the equipment, but also when it comes to coordination and organizing these events. Think about it. The police radios from Uvalde, school police, could not talk to. They couldn't get on the same channel as the city police. They couldn't get on the same channel as the county sheriffs. And the county sheriffs, all of them couldn't talk with the feds and border patrol who were coming. So the communication was just awful. And it's easy to say, but what was the physical manifestation of the communication problem? The problem is that the chief of police of the school police, Pete Arredondo, who is also first on scene, so he's the chief of police and he's first on scene, everyone assumed he's the incident commander. This guy's in charge. He didn't think that. He thought, I'm in this thing, whether he's right or not. Pete Arredondo thought, I was the first to arrive. I ran in here as fast as I could. I'm literally in the fight. So no, when I'm in the fight, clearly someone needs to be managing this, like the perimeter and the resources and where to go in the media staging area and inner perimeter and the outer perimeter. Clearly there should be someone outside who's directing all of that because that's how police officers are taught. So Pete Arredondo, reasonably or unreasonably, thought someone else should be in charge, the incident commander, but everyone else on scene thought that he should be the incident commander, and they weren't able to talk to each other. So these basic communication problems led to mass confusion and ultimately led to people dying. So that's one of the issues that I hope smaller police departments have taken into consideration, and just the communication on a basic level is one of the reasons why this happened. Also, there's this, we see what happens, and you know what? It wasn't just equipment and communication of why police officers didn't go in. And to not say this, I think would be dishonest. So this is what happens when you kill the warrior culture in policing. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's difficult to complain on one side that you don't want police officers, and I don't want police officers to break the law, obviously, but where police officers, we're hiring too many people from the military, too many people who are too aggressive, they're too quick to use force. And we talk about this warrior culture in policing and that it's a problem. There's books, there's podcasts, there's an entire social media channels dedicated to this warrior culture in policing. And that's fine. Let's listen to that criticism, but then don't complain when stuff like this happens. Okay, you cannot expect someone to be officer friendly, 100% reasonable. Well, you always expect an officer to be reasonable, but nice and friendly and mild-mannered the entire time. And when something like this happens, to just turn it on and just become the ultimate warrior and go in there. That's not a reasonable expectation. So I think that, when people talk about the warrior culture in policing, think about it. If this was a group of 20 guys who were warriors, who were on the SWAT team from Philly or Chicago, believe me, they would have gone in there and this wouldn't have happened. Okay, yeah, maybe those guys and those girls are jerks when you're contacting them on a traffic stop. Maybe they're not the ones that you want there if you're having a domestic issue with your spouse, because they're not that compassionate. But fuck, that is who you want there. So there is a place for a warrior culture in policing, and it's to avoid stuff like this. The next case I want to talk about that I think was an important case is Paul Pelosi. So I know it doesn't compare it to Uvalde, of course not, but the Paul Pelosi case, because think about this. He is married to the person who at the time was the number 3 in line to be the president of the United States. He's married to Nancy Pelosi. Not only did he get a DUI, he get a drunk driving arrest earlier this year in the spring, but he was also, while Nancy Pelosi wasn't home, he didn't have any security at the house. David DePappy, he came into the house, forced entry. There was a dispute, and then Paul Pelosi called the police, but he didn't seem, that he was that animated about it. Police got there. Somehow when police got there, he hadn't been injured, but once the police were there, that's when he got bopped over the head with a hammer. Him and David DePappy are both in their underwear. So I've gone down a lot of different things, a lot of rabbit holes, and maybe it sounds like I don't know what I'm talking about too much on this case. This is because no one really knows, because they haven't released the body cam footage. Okay, so even some earlier news reports that were put out about the case, they were taken back. and so we don't know what happened. So why I think the Paul Pelosi case is so important. It's not just because of who he was and what happened to him, but it's because of the transparency issue. This is such an important issue for me, is because we need to know what happens. And as I said when we first covered the Paul Pelosi case, if this was an officer-involved shooting, that if this was a white cop and a black guy and it was a controversial officer-involved shooting, believe me, this body cam footage would be released within hours, days at the very most, even if it meant that there was going to be riots and that it was going to make a police officer look bad and maybe make it unsafe for that police officer. No one gives a shit. That body cam is going to be released. But because it's Paul Pelosi and we don't want him maybe to be embarrassed, then we're going to go ahead and not release the body cam footage. So I'm not saying that, I guess I like consistency. I like intellectually honesty about this, is that we should release the body cam footage because it's interesting to the public, because there's a request, there's no more ongoing investigation, and it should have nothing to do with who's involved. So I feel very, very strongly about that. So that's why I think that the Paul Pelosi case is the second most important case of the year, just because of the issues around transparency that I think are just unbelievably important. Not just the body cam footage, but also the 911 call. I want to hear the 911 call. I'm curious what Paul Pelosi said. So a lot of these, and you know what? There's so many conspiracy theories that have sprung up about this case. And if they release the 911 call and the body camera footage, people might have different things to say about it, but there won't be a whole lot of conspiracies. So if people are against like the Alex Jones types conspiracy theories out there and think those people are absolutely ridiculous, well, be a little more transparent. I guarantee that kind of stuff stops. The last case that I want to talk about from this year that I think is the third or one of the most important cases, it was an officer-involved shooting that happened in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And not only is it an important case from 2022, but the officer was just charged with a crime. I'm going to get into it in a second, and that trial is going to happen in 2023. This is the #1 officer-involved police shooting case that I'm following going into the new year. Here's what happened. Patrick Loyola in Grand Rapids, Michigan, back in April. He was driving a vehicle. The vehicle had on the wrong license plates. Officer Christopher Schur, he conducted a traffic stop on the vehicle for not having the correct license plates. This is reasonable, right? Hey, if at any point while I'm going through this you think the cop did something wrong, put it in the chat and we'll go ahead and address it. So what happened is the officer conducted a traffic stop because the vehicle didn't have the right license plates. My opinion, that's reasonable. Oftentimes, stolen vehicles have the wrong license plates. The officer makes the traffic stop. Patrick Loyola steps out of the vehicle. Now, as a police officer, you know this is suspicious, this is strange. Now, the vast majority of the time, especially if it's during the day, sometimes at night when police lights are behind you, your entire car lights up. You know a cop is behind you, but I'm going to give it. Sometimes during the day, if it's bright outside and the officer isn't using a siren, there are a lot of situations where maybe a citizen just doesn't realize that a police officer is trying to pull them over. So this did happen during the day. So most of the time when there's a traffic stop and the individual just happens to pull in front of their house and they don't realize that a police officer was trying to pull them over, the vast majority of the time, the individual gets out and they almost immediately think, oh shit, and they apologize. They go, oh, sorry, and they get back in the car. Like, that's a normal human reaction. If I was out of town and I got pulled over and I didn't realize and I stepped out and that's what I would say. I would say, oh man, I'm getting pulled over. I would get back in the car. So that's a normal reaction. But Patrick Loyola didn't do that. Once he made eye contact with the police officer, he kind of started walking towards the police officer. So as a cop, and every cop knows this, when you have someone who steps out of a vehicle during a traffic stop and then makes eye contact with you, so realizes the situation and doesn't get back in the car, and they make eye contact with you and they lock in on you, that person is going to run or fight. Every cop knows it. Everyone knows that feeling that you get. That's a person who is going to run or fight. That's what Patrick Loyola did. Despite that, and that's why in a lot of cases, and there's so many body cam videos out there where a situation like this, where the officer just starts screaming at the individual because they know, hey, this isn't right, something's wrong. This is going down the path of something being wrong. And a lot of times that manifests itself as a police officer, not saying it's correct, but we see body cam footage of it. So, and cell phone videos, so I really can't deny it. A lot of times they pull out their guns or their tasers and they scream and yell, get back in the car, get back in the car. And, those are the kinds of videos. We see that again, I can't say it enough. We see it all the time. We know it happens. That's not what Officer Scher did. So the idea that Officer Scher was a racist or that he was some kind of jerk, we don't have any evidence of that because he doesn't do that to Patrick Loyola. He actually walks up to Patrick Loyola and he tells him the reason for the traffic stop. So he's, hey, can I have your driver's license? I did a traffic stop. He tells him the reason why. Hey, these license plates don't match. During this initial contact, he could tell, or he thought that, well, maybe Patrick Loyola, he had an accent. And he's like, well, maybe Patrick doesn't speak English. So he confirmed. He didn't just yell at him or berate him, or throw him to the ground. He asked him, do you speak English? Because he wanted to make sure that what he was saying was correct, or that the individual understood. This is a very reasonable and, let's say nice and respectful thing for Officer Scher to do. So we asked him if he spoke English, and Patrick Loyola said yes, that he did. Officer then again told him the reason for the traffic stop, asked for his driver's license. Patrick Loyola did have a front seat passenger. He when the officer asked for his driver's license, he opened the driver's side door, and you could see him talking to the passenger, and it looked like he was reaching for something. Then he takes off and he runs. And at this point, he hadn't given Officer Scher the driver's license, so Officer Scher chases him on foot. So there's some criticism of the officer about chasing him on foot. Okay, well, let's talk about that. So I don't think it was unreasonable. Here's why. So the suspected crime is a felony. You have the wrong license plates on a vehicle. That's a lot of time the suspected crime is auto theft or possession of stolen property. That's a felony. Also, he didn't have Patrick Loyola's driver's license. So it's not like if Patrick Loyola ran, he could just say, oh, well, okay, I'm not going to chase him, but I got this guy's ID. I'm just going to go back to the station. I'm going to write a warrant and we're going to serve a warrant on him later. You can't do that. So we have a felony offender who's unidentified running from a police officer. Very reasonable for a police officer to get involved in a foot chase. I don't have any problem with that. I don't know of any law, training, or policy that would prohibit that. Again, if it wasn't a felony, and if the officer had the individual's ID, yeah, I could actually see the argument of why are we chasing him for this? We know who this guy is. Let's just issue a warrant for him. Not the case here, though, okay? So then he chases him on foot. The first thing he doesn't just shoot him as he's running. The first thing he does is he catches up to him in a residential front yard and he goes hands-on. So he uses empty hand techniques in an effort to try to get Patrick Loyola in custody. This is good. He's starting at the lowest level of force. This is what we want cops to do. We don't want cops to just jump to a beanbag shotgun or a taser. Like, this is, if possible, we want cops to progressively increase force. So he tries to use empty hand tactics. Not successful. Then he goes to a taser. He tries to use the taser on Patrick Loyola. Taser isn't successful. The two men end up wrestling over the taser on the ground. Now, while they're wrestling for control of the taser, Officer Scher is yelling, let go of the taser. At some point, Patrick Loyola gets sole possession of the taser. At that point, Officer Scher believes that he is in immediate threat of a deadly force incident. He thinks that his life is in immediate danger because Patrick Loyola has sole control of the taser, and he shoots him one time. So the use of the deadly force, a lot of people criticize that, but I just want to talk about that for a second. So here's what you have to think about, and I've said it before, that a taser is not considered a deadly weapon from a police officer. Here's why. When you're in the police academy as a police officer, you are tased. When I went through taser training, I was tased. I was told I had to be tased. Found out later on that it's actually not part of the curriculum. Our police academy instructors just wanted us to go through it because they thought it was a good idea, or they were a little bit sadistic. Either way, it is a good idea because as a police officer, if it's a device you're going to be using against someone, obviously not a firearm, but if it's something that's non-lethal you're going to use against someone, it's reasonable to know like what the effects are. So I know what a taser feels like if it's done correctly. That's a good knowledge for police officers to have. So it's not that Patrick Loyola having the taser, shooting the taser and being shocked, that 5-second, 50,000 volts of electricity, that is not what's dangerous to a police officer. Again, we're tased in the police academy. Here's what's dangerous about being tased if you're a police officer. While you're being tased, that 5-second cycle, and if you keep pulling the trigger, you can make that 5-second cycle be 10 seconds, 20 seconds. You can just keep going as long as the probes are still attached, right? So it's while you're under control, you're incapacitated. You can't move. During that time being incapacitated, the individual, in this case, Mr. Loyola, could grab the officer's gun and shoot him in the face. Or Patrick Loyola could grab a rock and smash his head in. So if the likely outcome is death, then it's reasonable and proportional that when a police officer is faced with being tased, that they respond with deadly force. And I'm just going to say it in another way. If you think it's not a reasonable use of deadly force, here's what you're asking for a police officer to do. You're saying, hey, officer, here's a guy, he committed a felony, he ran from you, he fought with you, and he stole one of your weapons. Now he's tased you, okay? And we're going to ask you in that moment to trust him to not kill you when he has the ability to. So, what has the individual done? What has Patrick Loyola done in this brief interaction that would let the officer think that Patrick's a decent guy? He has good intentions. He's not going to hurt me. Literally everything that Patrick has done would lead a reasonable person to believe that he's going to hurt the officer. So the use of deadly force to me is a very reasonable thing. People complain about where the individual was shot because the officer shot him in the back of the head. Okay, fine, that looks bad. But you know what? Where the actual shot was placed isn't relevant. Here's why. Police officers are not allowed to shoot to wound, okay? It's not like police officers are only allowed to use their firearm in a situation that's deadly force. If you have a situation that isn't deadly force, they should not be shooting. They should be using a taser or a baton or a beanbag shotgun. So since police officers are legally and by policy only permitted to utilize a firearm in a deadly force situation, it doesn't matter if that deadly force shot is to the head, if it's to the chest, if it's to the arm, to the leg, that doesn't matter. What matters, what's relevant, not where the shot was placed, but the question of, was deadly force authorized? Was it legal? Was it reasonable? Was it justified? If the idea of deadly force is authorized, fine. Maybe it doesn't look good where he shot him, but honestly, it isn't a relevant matter. That's my opinion on that. Also, Patrick Loyola, some people say he didn't know what was happening. Listen, this guy had been arrested for stealing cars 3 different times. He had been arrested for domestic violence. On the day in question, he had a revoked license and 3 warrants for his arrest. That's why he ran. The thing is Patrick Loyola had been arrested at least 4 times prior, but you know what? He was never beat up, had force used against him, or shot by a police officer. You know why? Because he cooperated. But he took the specific act to steal a taser, and that's why he was shot and killed on this day. If he acts just like he did with his other 4 arrests, then Officer Scher doesn't harm him, and there is no question about that. I want to relate this just a little bit to the Garrett Rolfe case. So the Garrett Rolfe case, this was a case in Atlanta from 2020. You remember this case. It was a DWI investigation in Atlanta in the Wendy's parking lot, and during this, the investigation, Rayshard Brooks was over to overpower Officer Brosnan and Officer Rolfe. He overpowered them. He stole one of their tasers, and Rayshard Brooks is running away from the police officers with the taser in his hand. Officer Rolfe is following him. While running behind him, Rayshard Brooks takes the taser, points it at the officer. Officer Rolfe fires a shot. Officer Rolfe was initially, and kills him. Officer Rolfe was initially charged with murder. However, those charges were dismissed earlier this year, which is a good thing. It was pretty much the best piece of law enforcement news that in the legal world that almost any of us got, was that Officer Rolfe's charges were dismissed. But what the DA said the charges were dismissed. The DA said there is case law to show that when a police officer is faced with a taser, that the police officer can and should consider that to be a deadly force that's going to be used upon them. So again, it's not just me saying this. That's why charges were dismissed against Officer Rolfe, and then also against Officer Brosnan in that Atlanta case. And I guess it's a different state. We have Georgia, we have Michigan. Again, I guess it's a different state, but I'm going to make the argument that Officer Scher was actually in greater physical danger than Officer Rolfe was. Think about this. So Officer Rolfe is chasing behind Rayshard Brooks. Rayshard Brooks has a taser and points it behind. Okay, I think it was a lawful, reasonable, justified officer involved shooting. But if Officer Rolfe wanted to, he could have just stopped running. A taser only has a length of, 25 feet max? So Officer Rolfe could have just stopped running from Rayshard Brooks, and he wouldn't have been in danger anymore, right? As opposed to Officer Scher with Patrick Loyola, he was engaged in an active fight physically right with Patrick Loyola. So he was in more danger. And if we just look at this from a reasonable standpoint, if the Garrett Rolfe, if he was considered to be in fear, or his fear of being of being killed or great bodily injury was reasonable, the same thing, even more has to be for Officer Schur. Okay, let's see if we have any comments on that. Those are some of my thoughts about that case. Officer Schur is going to trial in 2023. It's the #1 case that I'm following because I think these charges against him are absolutely ridiculous. Let's see. Bruce Blankenship says, if you're going to shoot, shoot to kill. Okay, that's a good point. So the way that police officers are trained is they're trained to shoot to stop the threat. It's not shoot to wound. It's not shoot to kill. It's shoot to stop the threat. Meaning, if a police officer, if there's a deadly threat, a police officer shoots and the individual who had a gun throws the gun, well, there's no longer a deadly threat. You're shooting to stop the threat. The threat stopped. You stop shooting. So that's how police officers are trained. Police officers are not trained to shoot to wound. That's a good thing because let's look at this. Let's say, why didn't he shoot him in the leg? Okay, so if we all agree this is a situation that doesn't require deadly force, and here you are telling police officers under stress to try to shoot someone in the leg, the chance that they're going to hit a femoral artery and kill the person, yeah, that's a pretty high chance of that. So no, guns are for serious situations where deadly force is lawful and reasonable and justified. If we all agree that the individual isn't a deadly threat, cops shouldn't be shooting, and if they do, that is absolutely unlawful. Stray dog exposure. For every legitimate officer involved shooting, I can show you 100 that isn't legitimate yet still rude, justified by their own department in the crooked DA. Disagree. So I've actually covered this quite a lot, Stray Dog, on my Substack where I write on there. Comment there, comment here. You show me 100 officer-involved shootings that are not lawful where the officer wasn't held accountable. And what I mean by held accountable is that they weren't prosecuted. If an officer is prosecuted and a jury finds them not guilty, that's not the fault of the DA or the government, okay? You show me cases where it's obvious unlawful officer-involved shooting and the cop wasn't prosecuted. Show me 100 of those. I know you can't show me 10. Even if you show me 5, I'm going to say, well, there's 250 million annual citizen police officer contacts, and there's 1,000 officer-involved shootings. So no, it's absolutely not. It happens every day. Watch our videos. I will. Stray Dog, the exposure. I will watch your videos. I absolutely plan to because I'd love to go back and forth with you on this because I love the debate. I think it's excellent. Thank you for commenting, and I'm absolutely gonna check out your channel after this. Let's see, Bruce Blankenship. Well, exactly. You can miss a leg center mass in the norm. Yeah, so that's why police officers. Again, if it's not a deadly force situation, we all agree police officers shouldn't be using guns. Let's see. Stray the dog, I had to delete some off the channel because YouTube penalized me. Yeah, they absolutely do this. They will do that. Free says, I don't blame the cop. I don't either. Again, I try to take this Patrick Loyola case like I do with all cases. So all of these police cases have what I call decision points, okay? That's why, so it's a decision point is basically like, should I stop the vehicle? Okay, so, all right, it's easy to have criticism, the cops are bad, the cops are militarized, the cops are wild, the cops are racist. That's like dishonest criticism that no one takes seriously. But let's look at cases specifically, which is what I just tried to do with Patrick Loyola. Let's take it step by step. And if you think a police officer did the right thing, I want to hear what you have to say. But I want you to be specific about the criticism. Okay, here's a case, here's the traffic stop. The police officer should or shouldn't have made a traffic stop. Here's why. If you say no, well, why not? Is there law? Is there policy? Is there training? That's where I think there's a space for honest and interesting debate to take place, is criticism like that. Okay, well, that's just about going to be our show for the year. That was our last show. And again, if you think that there were some other really important police cases that should have made it into our top 3, put it in the chat, put it in there. I'll definitely look over it. Maybe we can go over a couple tomorrow or next week in an overfill that I didn't get to today. I just want to say thank you so much for everyone being on here. Make sure, and the conversation, the comments, they were excellent. Thank you all so much. I want to say that if you haven't followed our channel, please subscribe to our channel. Go ahead and follow me over at Police Law News. We will see you next week, and I want everyone to have a safe and happy New Year. Please do not drive intoxicated, and call for an Uber or a Lyft if you are going to be out there drinking. I hope everyone has a great and safe New Year. Thank you.